Open world games, your time has come.
Come to the front of the class.
You're finished. You're finished. You're finished. You're finished. Wallahi, you're finished.
Don't go to E3 tomorrow. I'm obviously saying that because E3 doesn't exist anymore. But on a serious note, open world games were once hailed as the pinnacle of gaming. I remember in the 2000s when open world games seemed to really get their footing with games like Morrowind, Oblivion, Far Cry 2, Knights of the Old Republic, and of course, GTA San Andreas. These games showed us the sheer amount of fun and freedom that came with being able to explore an entire world. Then, in the 2010s, it seemed like every AAA game was open world. Even now, a lot of my favorite games and some of the best games of all time are open world. And I am by no means calling all open world games bad or flawed, so please don't yell at me about that in the comments. But now it seems like the trend of open world games is going away, and there is this return to the level-based game. Sure, there are still some big releases that are open world, but it's not nearly as prevalent as it used to be, and it seems like we're fed up with the gimmick of the open world. And look, I can already sense someone going to comment, well actually, open world games are doing incredibly well right now. We have titles like Elden Ring, Tears of the Kingdom, and GTA 6 is probably going to be the biggest release of all time, so you're categorically wrong. And those are valid points, but there is this fatigue of the open world that a good chunk of us are experiencing, and that's really what I want to highlight in this video. I'm gonna keep it real with you guys, I never try to bullshit. The title of this video is kinda clickbaity, but I couldn't use something like We Are Tired of Open World Games because those titles and other titles similar to that have already been used. And I have to be provocative for the sake of YouTube.
I don't even know what that means.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
No, it's not. It's
Gets
gross.
the people going.
Don't hate the player, hate the game, son.
So are open world games officially dead as in no one is making them anymore? No, of course not. But open world games for a good portion of us are dying in the sense that they are not as fun as they used to be, and we have grown tired of this type of game. We can see this shift in preference with the best games of the past 2 years not being open world. The best games of 2023, like Baldur's Gate 3 and the remake of Resident Evil 4, are not open world. And the same can be said so far for 2024, with games like Helldivers 2, the Silent Hill 2 remake, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, Metaphor ReFantazio, and Black Myth Wukong all being linear games that lack an open world. The only universally acclaimed open world games from 2024 are the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Stalker 2. But 2 games is really not that many, especially when you compare it to prior years. But what went wrong? Why is the open world dying? And are games better off without open worlds? And those are not rhetorical questions. I don't see you typing up a comment, you're not gonna answer the question, bro? Come on, man, I need your help, how the hell would I know? That was my bait for engagement, so let's get into it. The first and most obvious issue I'll point out with open world games is the same issue with YouTubers becoming PDFs. Oversaturation. I said it before, but there was a good chunk of time where it really felt like every single game was open world. It felt like a box that studios had to check for the sake of appeasing their corporate overlords, and for the marketing of explore this completely unique open world. But as it turns out, when studios make a world without any love, then the players can feel this lack of passion. There are so many games with barren open worlds that won't get explored because they're boring, and these are a living testament to bigger not being better. Hey, I know a lot of people will be perfectly satisfied with one. What we care about in the spaces we explore is detail. A small level with hundreds of intricate details will always be more interesting than a giant sparse world. Take the bland open worlds of Rage 2 or Halo Infinite or the shithole that is Starfield and compare it to any level from games like Silent Hill 2, Dishonored, or Resident Evil 2, and the density of details becomes glaringly obvious. There are so many open worlds that just feel like filler space to the few handcrafted areas that serve the campaign, and this is in complete contrast to the level-based game that doesn't waste any space. By constantly having details to examine and admire, you never feel bored in a well-designed level. Sure, some open worlds are exceptional and are able to implement this detailing on a larger scale, but these are the exception and not the rule. There are so many open world games where traversing their maps just feels like a chore rather than an enjoyable element of the game's design. So to sum up this point, a good chunk of games feel forced into having open worlds, and this leads to a lack of passion from the developers, and we can feel this lack of love when we explore these unnecessarily large and undetailed games. On top of this, there was just a natural fatigue that came with all of the open world games being released back to back to back, even if they were good. If all you ate for a year was pizza, even if it was from the best pizza places in the world, you would get sick of it. Similarly, if you routinely got the baddest bitches the world had to offer, you would naturally get bored and want to try something else off the menu. Why do you think Diddy became gay? The same happened with open world games, and as a result, we felt the need to return to something a little more traditional. The criticism I made of detail usually only applies to the shitty open world games, but there is another trade-off that open world games make, and this issue can also be seen even in the goated open worlds. That issue is tension. It feels like it is in the nature of the open world game to struggle between finding the balance of urgency and freedom. On one hand, the game wants you to relish its open world and to take your time in witnessing all that it has to offer. On the other hand though, there is usually some looming threat in the main story that you need to address, and the entire fate of the world depends on it. The classic example of this is Skyrim, where once you leave the cave after Helgen, you are free to do whatever you want, but there is also this world eater named Alduin who is about to gobble up Tamriel. The tension and urgency in Skyrim dissipates, big video essay word, dissipates if you do a main story quest, then dick around, maybe finish the Thieves Guild storyline, become the listener of the Dark Brotherhood while you're at it, maybe even become the Archmage, because there is no such thing as a conflict of interest in the Rim. You get my point though. How are we supposed to feel as if the world is going to end if we don't do X, Y, and Z, if we can do whatever we want for however long we want without any consequence? I actually think the game before Skyrim does a better job of forcing this urgency onto the player. In Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, the Oblivion gates will keep spawning, causing the sky to turn red and the Daedra to attack you until you finish the main quest. There is a limit of gates, so the whole map doesn't get covered with them, but it's a pretty high amount, and more will spawn the longer you take to finish the main storyline. I understand they can become annoying, but this is a great way to encourage the player to address the looming conflict and to give them a reminder that this world is on the brink of collapse. Plus you get a sigil stone for each gate you close, and the overall concept of these raids for the player is just badass, especially on your first playthrough. Some other common ways that open world games try to force some urgency is to give the player a time limit to achieve a task. GTA does this quite a bit, or they will have a consequence for not using your time wisely. Minecraft is a great example of this, since when the night comes, that's when the monsters come out. But my personal favorite example of this is the volatiles that chase you in the dark in Dying Light. Some games don't have any urgency, and they emphasize freedom and the player having the creative space to do whatever they want. This is what we would call a sandbox game. These games usually don't have any narrative, and there is no pressure on the player. Nowadays, most of these sandbox games are multiplayer. But don't conflate this with the open world games that I am discussing that have a narrative and a planned story they want the player to experience. The main point I am making is that the urgency and freedom in an open world game can often counteract one another, and it can be difficult to find the balance. Consequently, open world games can struggle to establish a rhythm or consistent pacing when you compare them to a traditional linear game, because they want the player to set the pace themselves. Sometimes this works, especially if you work through things sequentially, but the safer bet is to dictate the pace for the player. That's what makes games like Resident Evil 4 and The Last of Us so legendary, because they throw the player in the deep end and force them to keep up. But just to be clear, it's not impossible for an open world game to have tension and rhythm, but more often than not, Games don't execute this very well. The next point I will make about open world games and why they are falling out of popularity is for a simple reason that I just alluded to. We are all submissive by nature.
The idea of submission, like part of this strong open world thing here that this questioner is tangled up in, is there's no submission in open world games, if you have any sense.
This is why society tries to grab a hold of us since we're young and pigeonhole us down these predetermined pathways of how we will contribute to society. You will go to school, you will get a job, you will pay taxes, you will like, you will subscribe, you will comment, or something. In an open world game, there really is no submission, and that might seem like a good thing, but sometimes it can lead to the paradox of choice, where we have so many options available that we become paralyzed in what to do. And it's here that we crave some order and structure, and sometimes it doesn't hurt when a game restricts our freedom and guides us on a path determined by the developers. Sometimes the chaos and freedom of an open world game becomes boring and we crave order. I'm gonna sound like an unk, but I don't have the same amount of time to game like I did when I was a kid. Sometimes you get home from work or school, and you only have 1 or 2 hours to game, and so you want those hours to be memorable and filled with action. You don't want to get on a game and basically do chores for 2 hours. You would rather use that time to experience a memorable story or an action-packed adventure. As we get older and free time becomes more of a rare commodity, we naturally crave games that can accommodate our tighter schedules. As I mentioned before, this uniformity in pacing is also just much better in telling a story. When you're playing a linear game, the narrative is much easier to absorb and develop when that is the central focus of the game, and it doesn't have any other distractions or elements that it has to simultaneously juggle. Games that are linear and that tell you a story can feel more immersive because you are made to embark on this journey and you play to the rhythm of the designer. There are also no breaks in the action when compared to an open world game. I love open world games, but opening your map and fast traveling from location to location can become dull and it breaks the immersion pretty fast. What's the point of a handcrafted world if you're just gonna traverse it through loading screens? This is actually one of the reasons why I love Fallout 4's survival mode, because it cuts the fast travel and forces you to engage with the world. I also love other games that lack fast travel, like Morrowind or Dying Light, because they make you interact with the carefully crafted environments. Now, a lot of what I'm saying in this point relates to my previous argument, but they go hand in hand. Sometimes you want order, and freedom can just lead to confusion. Sitting down on the PC or console and playing a linear game can feel like a better use of your time than running errands in an open world, and the uniform pacing is also great in getting your time's worth. On top of this, there are plenty of games that can mix the best parts of an open world with the pacing of a linear-based game. Plenty of games now feature large levels that have plenty of space to explore and things to tinker with, but they also follow the narrative in a natural way. Games like Dishonored, Detroit Become Human, God of War Ragnarok, and the newer Hitman games come to mind. These games offer the best of both worlds, by letting the player have freedom, but they also follow a methodically planned structure. The last point I will make is probably the most obvious. Gaming and its subgenres follow a trend where the tides slowly turn, perpetually moving from one end of the spectrum to the other. It's like fashion, where oversized becomes the trend, but then the spectrum swings back to skinny fit and form-fitting clothing, but then a few years go by and it's back to oversized. And this goes on forever. Some generations we get an overdose of open world games, and it feels like they are all the rage. Pun intended. And other generations we notice a shift back to the linear game. Right now it feels like we are going back to the linear game, and while open world games are still there for sure, they are not as common as they used to be. So while open world games may not be as abundant as they once were, they will come back for sure. Also, right now we are living in some amazing times for gaming. It's not like the 90s or the 2000s, when open world games were still getting their footing and establishing themselves. If you want to play an open world game, the catalog is vast, and there are so many masterpieces for you to choose from. If you want a linear game, then the options are also seemingly endless. And there is no better way to protect your data while gaming than to use today's sponsor, Nord. Just kidding, I'll never get a sponsor. NordVPN, I haven't forgot, buddy. You turned me away when I was at 1300 subs, but I'm like an elephant. And not because of my memory, but because I'm a fat ass. So while open world games may not be as prevalent as they used to be, who gives a shit, because you can play whatever you want. So why did I even make this glorified yap session?
I prefer really not to speak. If I speak, I am in big trouble. In big trouble. And I don't want to be in big trouble.